Dr. Wakefield just mentioned smallpox and polio, so I want to address the history of both of these vaccines. We'll cover smallpox in this episode, and then we'll get to polio in the next episode. Edward Jenner was born in 1749 in Berkeley, Gloucester. He was orphaned at age 5, and he went to live with his older brother. During his early years, Edwin developed a strong interest in science and in nature that continued throughout his life.
If we go back to the dawn of this idea, Dr. Jenner was observing, as a number of people had, that the milkmaids that were milking the cows that had the cowpox didn't suffer from smallpox.
And this is a couple hundred years ago.
Oh, this is way back, yeah. So some of them posited that, I wonder, if there's a reason that they're getting or encountering this cowpox, that it might have something to do with preventing the smallpox. So they started taking the pustules and the material, the debris from the cows with cowpox, and they would open up the arms of victims, I call them, and stuff that biological material, unknown material, into these arms of these people, these kids. And there was a high-level sepsis, blood disease, there was amputations because of it, there was death, and there was smallpox as well. But the idea of vaccination, vacca meaning cow, comes from that concept. Now, they had no idea of immunology at the time. It was an observation, and I'm not against observing things, but then to violate the way the natural order of the universe is and work, and violate the skin and puncture it and put all these unknown materials in there, it's a disaster. It's horrible. And that's where this all started.
Smallpox was a big problem. People were dying, it would accumulate in the throat, these pox, and people would suffocate and they couldn't swallow. It was painful, there was scarring, was horrible. But like any disease, you have to look at what the conditions of the environment was like, which tells you how well people's immune systems are able to work. And that's really the key. And then on top of that, it's how the disease was treated. So people have been trying to fight smallpox for a long time. For thousands of years, they had been trying to come up with, in ancient Hindu times, they were trying to take scabs of smallpox victims and use those for vaccines. And each time what happened was that just epidemics were started when this happened. So using smallpox. Yes, because using smallpox as a vaccine, they didn't know how to attenuate, which means to make the vaccine weaker, the virus weaker. And so they were basically just giving a controlled case of smallpox. And it didn't go well because, of course, it spread to any contacts, and there was an incubation period where people wouldn't know they were infected. So that plan failed several times in different parts of the world.
What was interesting, of course, about smallpox is that you were deceiving the immune system by giving vaccinia or cowpox, which was structurally similar to smallpox, which seemed to, at least theoretically, produce an immune response against the smallpox virus. And Jenner noted, as other people did, is that girls who got cowpox from milking cows were protected against smallpox. And all that led to him then practicing on his son, experimenting on his son and his next door neighbor, and giving them multiple doses of this very, very crude extract of cowpox. And ultimately, I believe, leading to catastrophic failure in their immune systems and death of both children later as young adults. So not an experiment that you would necessarily consider well designed or a good outcome.
Dr. Wakefield said that Jenner actually inoculated his own son and neighbor with smallpox. The neighbor boy's name was James Phipps, and he was only 8 years old when he was initially inoculated. Over the next 12 years, Jenner's son and James Phipps both were inoculated over a dozen times. Phipps died at the age of 20, and Jenner's own son died at the age of 21, both from tuberculosis. Since then, the smallpox vaccine has been linked to tuberculosis. Vaccinations became mandatory in England in 1853, and by 1857, fines and imprisonment awaited people who refused to be vaccinated against smallpox. Dr. Humphreys just mentioned that once smallpox vaccinations became mandatory in England, massive epidemics began to occur. According to official figures of the Register General of England, between 1857 and 1859, there were over 14,000 deaths from smallpox. Then, between 1863 and 1865, there were over 20,000 smallpox deaths. A few years later, there were almost 45,000 smallpox deaths between 1870 and 1872. But England wasn't the only place to make smallpox vaccinations mandatory. It happened in the United States too. In 1855, Massachusetts enacted forced smallpox vaccination laws. Similar to what happened in England, following the 1855 mandate, there were smallpox epidemics in 1859, 1860, 1864, 65, and 67, culminating with the infamous epidemic in 1872 and 1873. Similar events occurred in Germany, Japan, Scotland, Ireland, Sweden, Italy, Holland, Austria, and Japan during the late 1800s. As vaccination rates increased, so did the incidence and deaths from smallpox. I won't go into all the graphs and numbers, but they're readily available.
The doctors of the time were, saying that this is absurd, that we're still seeing plenty of smallpox in people who have been cowpox vaccinated, and that this vaccine is far from safe, that people were having major issues from it. Deaths were happening. In some cases, in the years that the vaccine was being used, the hospitalization rates and death rates for smallpox were higher than the years before the vaccine was even invented. Then there was, this episode in a city called Leicester in England at the time where they had a 95% infant vaccination rate and had some of the worst epidemics in history in that city. And so people were outraged because mandatory vaccination had been instituted, people were being arrested and their belongings confiscated. Horrible. We went through a lot of these stories in the book. And so people had had enough, and so they demonstrated. And so there was this great demonstration, which is one of our chapters. And there was a big rally with over 80,000 people that showed up. I mean, these people were angry. Their kids were getting really messed up from this vaccine, and it wasn't working. So it's one thing to take the risk of getting a vaccine if it's working, but in this case, it was lose-lose for them. So they decided they were going to stop vaccinating. And instead, whenever somebody had smallpox, they had people that were already immune tend to the person, and they sanitized everything in their midst and kept them isolated. And that turned out to be actually the best way to deal with smallpox in communities. And so, predictions of doom and gloom that there was going to be a wildfire of smallpox set upon the planet as a result of this lunatics who wanted to stop vaccinating were, dictated from on high. And of course that didn't happen. And we give you the exact numbers in Dissolving Illusions of how the death rates plummeted and how the outbreaks actually went down significantly. And Leicester, compared to the surrounding towns that continued to vaccinate heavily, had the lowest death rates. And in lots of cases, the actual outbreak rates as well.
The eradication of smallpox was actually really a function of containment and isolation, of quarantine, rather than the vaccine itself.
Dr. Humphreys mentioned a city called Leicester in England. It's very interesting what happened in the city, which saw a massive outbreak of smallpox in 1871, despite an almost 100% vaccination rate. Quarantine and isolation, according to Dr. Wakefield, led to the eradication of smallpox. And Dr. Humphreys just mentioned a rally in Leicester, England in 1885 where 80,000 people got together and protested mandatory vaccines. They actually won their freedom of choice. Over the next 8 years, the vaccination rate there went from approximately 95% down to only 5%. And during this period, if someone had smallpox, everyone in the infected area was placed in strict quarantine and the house was thoroughly disinfected. She documents the way that the death rates decreased drastically after they implemented quarantine and isolation. These facts are illustrated in depth with studies, graphs, and charts in Dr. Humphreys' book, Dissolving Illusions. Consistent with this theme, according to the World Health Statistics Annual, 1973 to 1976, Volume 2, and I quote, "There has been a steady decline of infectious diseases in most developing countries, regardless of the percentage of immunizations administered in these countries." Now that's certainly an interesting quote, and we'll discuss the decline of several infectious diseases in a later episode. We're going to look at the graphs and we're going to see what's true and what's false. I want to focus on one word in that quote, the word immunization. Beginning with smallpox, the process was referred to as variolation, or inoculation, and it was the beginning of what we now call vaccination. In today's vernacular, oftentimes the terms vaccination and immunization are used interchangeably. But are they the same thing?
I want to be very clear up front. As a scientist who owns my own private science lab, I am not opposed to the theory of immunization, the theory of it, how the body could respond to things and build its own immune system. What I am vehemently opposed to is the quack science behind the pushing of toxic vaccines that contain toxic elements and toxic chemicals that harm and kill children all across the world.
So, you're not against the theory of vaccines, but you are against the way that they're pushed today.
No,
and
I said I'm not against the theory of immunization.
immunization. Explain the difference.
Vaccination is not immunization. So your body has a natural process of immunization in response. It's an adaptive response to exposure to, for example, live viruses that are all around us. You immunize yourself when you are exposed to a virus. Your body recognizes it because you have this functioning immune system, the blueprints of which are built into every cell of your body. You're a biochemical master of immunization. Yeah. You would not be alive if your ancestors weren't really, really good at this. So we immunize ourselves naturally all the time through exposure to viruses that make some people sick. Well, who do they make sick? The people who are vaccinated. Why is that? Because the vaccines harm the immune system. They compromise the immune system. They weaken the immune system. In the same way that you send an astronaut into space and they have no gravity, they have no stress on their bones and stress on their muscles. What happens? They atrophy. They lose bone density. They lose muscle mass. They come back to the planet and they can hardly walk. Why is that? They become weak. Vaccines do that to your immune system. They make your immune system weak and make you vulnerable to other infections. A healthy immune system, practicing healthy immunization, is in people like you and I. I haven't been vaccinated since I was a kid, and I haven't been sick in over a decade. Why is that? Am I somehow, have I been able to avoid all viruses? No. I'm shaking people's hands, I'm in public spaces, people cough on my food just like they cough on your food. Why am I not sick? Because my body is exhibiting its own immunization without vaccination.
Immunization has nothing to do with vaccines themselves. So people have to start using these two words correctly. If they really conferred immunity, they wouldn't have to keep giving these booster shots. Real immunity is for life.
Our bodies were designed and created to develop an immune response, and when they're healthy, they create it. So when you're exposed to an infectious agent, it's going to form the protective antibodies. Not only for a short term like you do with vaccines, but it's going to do it virtually indefinitely, and in most cases lifelong. You have lifelong permanent immunity when you have a healthy immune system and you're exposed to an infectious agent. That's the ideal. You know, now they're doing these vaccines and it's like, well, maybe every 10 years, maybe every 5 years. You know, there are third, fourth boosters of DPT now. It's going to be 10 boosters. You're going to have to get it every year. It's just insane because it's not the way the body was designed to create an immune response. When you do it artificially, it's almost universally going to be less than ideal.
The way you naturally develop an immune response is through breathing a virus in the air or breathing it into your nose, never being injected directly into your bloodstream.
It does make sense that if vaccines conferred real immunity, which is for a lifetime, then there would be no need for booster shots. And as Dr. Group just mentioned, we're never naturally exposed to a virus by injection, but rather by breathing. To be clear, the terms vaccination and immunization refer to two different things. The purpose of The Truth About Vaccines is to facilitate discussion and debate on this controversial topic of vaccines. And in order to spur discussion, it's important to ask questions. That's all we're trying to do here, because in the current climate, you cannot question vaccines in any way, shape, or form.
It's like a Platonian philosophical technique. It's just it's a presupposition.
Yeah.
If you presuppose it's true, you don't even question it. I mean, there is no question. It's just, this is what you do. And you start to give babies starting 6 months old the flu shot, and you start to do this and you start to do that. It's like, it's not even questionable anymore.
Right.
And that's where it becomes dangerous, because the people who do question, they're considered the outliers. They're considered the dangerous ones. And now look what's happening around the country.
I know how medical establishment is operating, and that doctors have to follow certain protocols. And if they were to understand that if they follow these protocols and they harm people, it would be very hard for them as humans to do that. So the establishment is making everything possible to prevent doctors from realizing that what they're doing might be harmful. Therefore, you have these studies that seemingly deny what is obvious to the eye.
My articles could not be published because we rejected this. The editor doesn't even send the article out for review. The editors is not specialist. The peer reviewers are the specialists. Basically, when customarily, when you send an article a manuscript to a journal, the editors look at the journal, look at your manuscript, the editor look at the manuscript, and then refer to the experts. That's called peer reviewers. The peer reviewers are the experts, but they stop at the editorial level. They don't send the manuscript out for peer review. That is the problem. And even in one article, the first article I tried to publish the HPV DNA in the vaccine, the editors sent out for peer review, and all 3 peer reviewers say this manuscript could be or should be reported, should be published. And then after the agreement for publication, the editor find a reason to reject it. That's editorial censorship. Then I have to submit it to another journal. And fortunately, I find another editor who's more sympathetic.
And you found a journal to finally
publish it. That's our one of the problems in revealing the truth. The ugly truth may not be welcome.
If the debate is frowned upon and not allowed, then you have to ask the question, why isn't it okay to talk about these issues? What is at stake here? Why wouldn't we want to have the safest, the healthiest, and the most scientifically based vaccine schedule that we possibly could?
Why is this taboo? Why can't we do rigorous scientific studies with one group that's vaccinated and one group that's not? We should have at least 30 studies like that on every vaccine, but we have 0 on every vaccine. We don't have any studies like that. And I started to become aware that something is wrong. Somebody's trying to hide something, right? As soon as it's like, oh, you can't talk about that, it's like, well, why not? Why can't we talk about that?
Science is not taking place here. Fraud is taking place. And we've got to get back to science. We've got to get back to demanding science take place. When, what I find fascinating when I question doctors and pediatricians that are involved in this, and you're within a minute and a half, you realize that their entire understanding of vaccines is just because they told me so, just because they said it was safe. It's safe because they told me it was. Well, do you understand how a vaccine works? Well, I know how to give a vaccine. No, but do you know how it works? Do you understand that it's not going through safety testing? Do you realize it's not categorized, a vaccine is not categorized like a pharmaceutical drug, that it doesn't have to go through the same safety tests as being rushed down the market? Well, no, but I mean, it's safe. And they just keep repeating this line. You're like, oh my God. Well, these poor doctors really, in a way, have spent a fortune on an education that has robbed them of actual information. And so you realize this fraud and this mantra of vaccines are safe. Don't talk. Vaccines are safe. They're safe. They're safe. They're efficacious. I mean, it's just not true.
It's like saying the sky is blue, and some people come up and say, no, it's not blue. It's it's green. It's pink. I don't care how you spin it. The truth is the truth. Right. It's blue. Okay, you can describe it as azure. You can say it's sky blue. What? It's still blue. You can't say it's green. You can't. So a lot of people will say, "Oh, well, that's a controversial subject, Dr. Pitar." There's no controversy about the truth. You can doubt the truth and say, "Oh, it's not the truth," or "It's controversial," but it still remains the truth. Just by labeling it something else doesn't change the truth.
So when the whole measles outbreak occurred in January of 2015, and I say outbreak very loosely, it turned out to be about 150 people infected with the measles virus, and just about all of them recovered fully. One person, unfortunately, did die from the measles. That person was highly immunocompromised, very sick, and only on autopsy was it shown to have measles. But what happened with me was when a friend of mine called, she's a PR representative, and she wanted me to go on NBC, the local affiliate in Phoenix, to talk about the measles outbreak. So I went on NBC, did my piece on there, and that led to a lot of commentary on the Arizona Republic website. And that commentary was large part negative. People were very upset. They were immediately calling for my censorship, for my license.
If you offend the powers that be, if you offend public health, if you offend the pharmaceutical industry and threaten their bottom line, as we did by calling into question the safety of MMR, there is no price that you will not pay. That's it. It isn't, people talk about conspiracy theory. This is just ruthless pragmatism. we will destroy you in order to protect our bottom line. And that's the way these people operate.
There have been ramifications for me professionally for making the decisions that I've made, because choosing to not vaccinate on the schedule. I used to be affiliated with Children's Hospital Boston, which is a very conventional institution. And they have a program where pediatricians out in the community can bring medical students into their office and sort of mentor them for a couple of days. It's really only a couple of days a year. But of course I would be talking to my patients about my philosophy and the way I do things in front of these medical students. So after a while, word got back to the powers that be over at Children's Hospital Boston that I wasn't vaccinating on the schedule. So the first thing they did was to tell me that they didn't want me participating in that program anymore of mentoring medical students, because, hey, they didn't say it in this way, but it's like, we don't want our medical students hearing an alternative philosophy or hearing a different point of view. So mind you, it's not that I was forcing anybody to not vaccinate on the schedule. Parents were coming to me with their children because they wanted to not vaccinate on the schedule. I was offering an alternative. There's certainly 1,001 pediatricians out there who would, vaccinate them, by the guidelines. So I stopped having these medical students in my office. So the next thing that happened was the next time every year or maybe every 2 years, you have to re-credential with the hospital so that you can be on their roster, so that your patients can go in there if they're sick, and so that you can be affiliated with insurance companies and the patient visits can be covered. So they told me they weren't going to allow me to stay on their list of affiliated doctors because of this issue, which would mean that I couldn't be affiliated with Blue Cross Blue Shield or some of the insurance networks. So it was really a form of marginalizing me, blacklisting me for this choice that I had made. So there's ramifications for doctors who are making these kind of choices.
Dr. Wakefield, Dr. Wolfson, and Dr. Leviton are just 3 of literally hundreds, if not thousands, of doctors that have suffered professional ramifications for attempting to facilitate discussion about vaccines and for giving their patients the freedom of choice not to follow the CDC vaccine schedule. When debate and scientific questions are not allowed to be asked, when ad hominem attacks are rampant, and when name-calling is pervasive, the subject of vaccines almost becomes more of a religious type of a debate as opposed to a rational scientific debate.
It's gathered an extraordinary momentum, taking on the life of a religion rather than any kind of science or primary public health measure.
It's a sacrament in the Church of Pharmaceutical Mysticism. It is not a real scientific endeavor anymore. It's about the holy grail attempt, if you will, to achieve artificial antibody stimulation. Or they might claim that the antibodies are real, but they're not the same thing, and they don't provide the same level of immunity should you acquire and encounter the disease in the natural state. And that's a big problem, but they'd like us to believe that it isn't.
It is such a religious belief that when you present a physician or somebody who believes it and doesn't know why they believe it with contrary information, they immediately get very defensive and angry and incensed and furious. And I understand that because it means that everything they have been taught to believe is topsy-turvy and really messed up. And if that's true, then they've been lied to. I mean, they're not consciously thinking all of this, but I mean, I've analyzed why it's so, but that everything they've been taught, they've been lied to, they've been, if that's not true, then what else isn't true? And if you're a doctor, then, I've had doctors tell me, I don't want to know anymore because I'll have to change the way I practice, and I just can't do that. Like, it's overwhelming. And some doctors who are really smart can't hear it. They can't hear it, and I'm like, okay, they're yelling at me, like, you're a quack, and you're dangerous, and you're killing patients.
It's not all just money. It's also, there's the dogma that if anybody says anything bad about vaccines, you're going to fuel this, this mythical anti-vaccine movement, and children are going to start dropping dead. So you're going to your actions could end up killing babies.
This is the most grounded, firmly entrenched belief in preventive medicine and health and conventional medicine, that this vaccine are crucial to be healthy. And in my belief, nothing could be further from the truth.
How is it that the opinion that all vaccines are safe and all vaccines are effective has become so firmly entrenched in our society that it's not even up for debate?
This network president told me that if one of his talk shows allowed me on the air, that he would fire the host. This person is a friend of mine. And I would have to fire the host because this is where our advertisers are. And if he lost an advertiser, it's a major catastrophe for the network. One of the problems is that is that all of the institutions in our democracy that are designed to protect little children from a predatory corporation have in essence been neutralized or removed. You've had the Vaccine Act got rid of all the lawyers and all the judges and the class action suits and multi-district litigation suits and depositions and all of the things that curb bad corporate behavior in every other sector, including the pharmaceutical sector. They've gotten rid of the CDC by capturing that agency. So that's the agency that's supposed to be the frontline agency that protects little children from a predatory corporation, and they are now have been thoroughly captured by the industry they're supposed to regulate. The press has effectively been neutralized. If all you have to do, Ty, is sit down and watch the 6 o'clock news on TV and see how many of those stories are bracketed by pharmaceutical ads. I was told by a network executive that during non-election years, during some months during non-election years, up to 70% of his news division revenues are coming from pharma.
I started looking at the playbook.
Okay.
So the playbook for vaccines is the same playbook that they're using for GMOs. So if the industry hires shills, not only, so in the vaccine world, it's not just the industry. We have the CDC looking for mommy bloggers, looking to pay people to blog as though they're just lay people, but there's federal dollars going to pay these people.
And they basically
and it's to promote
do what?
promote vaccines.
The system to promote vaccines, so if you make vaccines, you want them given. And if you can have it become a standing order, that is a guaranteed sale. So the push has become vaccinate, and the push has become let's get the message out there, vaccines are safe and effective, and let's squash any idea that there's a problem with vaccines. And if our media would be honest, they would look into things like this. And this is the problem we have with our media. I really feel like they pick and choose how they're going to report on things. If there's something that's along the lines of vaccines are safe and effective, you hear about it immediately. I read studies all the time that should be headlines, and nothing.
It effectively locks out any kind of debate that you have, not just in the major networks, but also in the so-called alternative media, which is supposed to be the antidote to corporate control of our country. Places like Salon and Slate and Huffington Post and Daily Beast and Mother Jones, also those media outlets will not cover this debate. I think it was Malcolm X said that the greatest power of the press is the power to ignore, and that's what we see in this sphere.
The power to ignore those who question vaccines and not cover the debate is an enormous power. But just because the press has the power to ignore, we refuse to ignore the topic of vaccines. Please remember, when we discuss pediatricians and doctors in general, we're talking about lots of good people, noble people, in a noble profession.
I'm convinced that 99.9% of every young adult going into medical school have a heart to serve, have a heart to help. I do believe there are some people out there in it for the money, but by far, most kids are in school trying to do what's good, and then they get indoctrinated. And you look at the research, and then you look at the textbooks, and everything is formulated in a very biased way to convince people to one direction. So you graduate after really being brainwashed for 8 years, And then you just, well, here's what we got to do. It's a public health service. And I actually studied at one of the premier public health schools in the world. And I'm telling you, you want to talk about social pressure? That's a public health banner. That's what their focus is on. It's hard to buck the system because you don't even know you're bucking the system at first. I think it's really important to remember too, these individuals aren't the enemy. To me, the enemy is, yes, the system, the big pharmas, the old white-haired men that are just like in the background making billions. I mean, there are people, you can look at this, but at the end of the day, the doctor, the physician, they're just trying to help.
Part of it is why it brings me to tears when I think about it, is because, it's just, I mean, rationally you can objectify. I didn't know any better. I mean, there's no question, but it still caused harm. I really did not know, and I failed miserably on my responsibility of doing my due diligence on, selecting a therapy that I believed would have more benefit. And in reality, I just did not do my homework.
Most doctors are good people who are just trying to help, but they're hamstrung by a broken system which discourages questioning medical dogma, and as we saw earlier, even encourages physicians to coerce patients into accepting medical procedures to which they do not consent.
Science is accessible to anyone who wants to learn it. And that's the beauty of what I do and what we have in this world, which is still relatively free, is that any of us can pursue science and use it to expose the toxins that are in medicines. And that science is irrefutable because it's reproducible in any lab anywhere else in the world.
I mean, we have to start talking to each other. The public health officials have to talk to the parents have to talk to the doctors. We all have to sit down and talk about these issues. This is not religion, this is science. We don't have to agree, but we can look at the evidence and figure it out together. We can't say, when you say it's off limits and you can't talk about it, that's when you should start having as many conversations as possible.
Once I saw this, it was impossible for me to walk away from it. It was like seeing a mugging on the street, or like being, just seeing some horrible atrocity. Like watching having been down at the train station in 1939 in Warsaw or Berlin and seeing, people shipped off to the camps, and you have to make a decision about whether to put your head down and pretend you didn't see it and protect your career, or whether you're going to speak up about it. And I felt like I didn't have a choice.
I hope you've enjoyed the first episode of The Truth About Vaccines. We have 6 more episodes coming your way. Tell your friends and family, and tune back in for the next episode. Thank you, and God bless. Do you want to support our mission to educate the world on the truth about vaccines? Then help us spread the word by clicking the links below and sharing on Facebook, Twitter, and all the other social media sites. Your support makes a huge difference in how many people we reach and ultimately how many lives are saved. Thanks in advance, and please click the links below to help us spread the word.
I can